today from Alok Sharma. We made huge strides in Glasgow, meaningful shifts in global commitments, taking climate change to over 90% of emissions covered by countries now with net zero targets. So a big, big progress. But we know it's still not enough. So what will world leaders do? Will they do what's required when they reconvene in Egypt later this year? We've also heard today, we've had geopolitical events. The context for COP27 shifted quite significantly. So with less than 6 months to go, what do our panel think we need to see from the UK in its remaining time as COP President, and what can we look forward to in Sharm el-Sheikh? The panel, we've got a terrific lineup. We're going to be moderated and chaired by the CBI's President, Lord Columbia-Moria. And joining Karen on the stage, we have Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, Zara Balarumi from Salesforce, and Alicia Gilbert from the Grantham Institute for Climate Change. Karen, would you and your panel like to join me on stage, and we'll get underway.
After you. Why are you going there?
Mary, please.
Brought my glass.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and what a day it's been. It's been fantastic. And started with my friend and colleague and Director General, Tony Danker, and what a speech. And we've got a really good session after this as well. So we've got a super panel, super panel. If I may, once again, Mary Robinson, who's a great hero of mine, former President of Ireland. We met, have met over the years, but including at Dublin at One Young World years ago, which was a fantastic event. That's the first time I met Meghan Markle, but let's not get distracted. And of course, we also have Zara, who's the head of Salesforce. And by the way, at the concert at Buckingham Palace on Saturday evening, Salesforce was on every wristband on 22,000 people. Great sponsorship, I noticed it. And also Alyssa, who's Director of Policy and Transition at Imperial College, right next door. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much. So before I start asking the panel some questions and also then opening it up to the floor, I just want to make a couple of opening remarks, if I may. The first thing is that I was at COP26 in Glasgow for 1.5 out of the 2 weeks at COP26. And I spoke at about 35 different events. And it was fantastic. It was the first COP, I'm told by the COP veterans, where business was present in a massive way. And I mean, some of the stats are huge. We've got 3/4 of the world, equating to 90% of global emissions, are now covered by net zero targets, including, I was born and brought up in India, may not be 2050, but it's committed to a target. China, may not be 2050, it's committed to a target. We've also had phenomenal participation by business. So our top companies in the UK, 60% of the FTSE 100 had committed to net zero by 2050. And of course, that huge announcement that Tony mentioned in his opening speech of $130 trillion worth of finance that's out there. So with COP26, we're looking ahead now, this panel, to COP26. There was an interim meeting in Denmark as a stopping point update, and now we're looking ahead. Now, what happened at COP26? What about COP27? And we need more commitment, re-energized commitment. We need to go further, as we did at COP26. And Alok Sharma, my friend, who I've known for many years, I've known his father for many years, he spoke about this new transition task force. Now, here are just a couple of statistics. A friend of mine, very good friend of mine from the UAE and a fellow YPO member, Badr Jaffer, he just wrote a piece recently, Energy Transition Must Not Come at a Cost to Fragile Societies. And he says here, it was Jimmy Carter in 1977 who first spoke about the need for permanent renewable energy sources. Can you imagine? I don't know how many of you are aware of that. That's 40 years ago. And yet, 40 years later, in spite of $300 billion of investment every year in the last decade into renewables, with COP26, here's a fact, that greenhouse gas emissions have reached an all-time high. At the first COP in 1995, emissions were 40% lower than they are today. So with all the efforts, it's still rising. And over 40% of cumulative global emissions from the beginning of the industrial age were generated to fuel the economic prosperity of the United States and Western Europe, although both account for less than 7% of global population today, a mere 2% of emissions have come from the entire continent of Africa. And then he makes this point. This is the reality we're faced with. Stunting economic development, which is undeniably underpinned by affordable and accessible energy, and which has seen global poverty rates fall by over 75% since 1990, which is fantastic, is not an option. So what do we do about a balanced and tailored greener energy evolution so that we have development as well as equity? And of course, then he makes the point about urbanization, and cities now account for nearly 60% of population, but less than 3% of our landmass. And I'm a commissioner of the Oxford University Healthy Cities Commission, which is reporting on the 16th, next month. It's going to be reporting next month. And then Tony mentioned this in his speech, the whole challenge over here of heating homes, and I chaired the Heat Commission. The final point I want to make sure we cover this in the panel, it's not just climate change. It is also biodiversity. And he talks about mangrove habitats throughout Asia and Africa being decimated. Sapartha Dasgupta's report on the economics of biodiversity, which, by the way, he may win a Nobel Prize for. It's a fantastic report if you haven't read it, talking about nature as our most precious asset, talking about 1 million species being in threat of extinction, and David Attenborough referring to it as our moral compass, referring to that report as our moral compass. And then the circular economy, which in my industry, as the founder and chairman of Cobra Beer, producing beer is circular economy in action. The waste grain from the brewing process goes to cattle feed. The waste yeast drained from the fermentation process goes to make Marmite. The carbon dioxide is captured and reused. The waste water is treated for effluent and is reused. So we try and waste as little as possible and reuse as much as possible. So the circular economy in action. So fantastic, fantastic things to discuss. And if I may ask the first question, and this is the first question, this is, I'll ask initially one at a time, and then I'm not going to do that again. So I'm just giving you a little bit of warning on that. So the moment this is pledges into action, how optimistic are you after COP26 with what's happened in the world and the Ukraine war and the energy crisis and inflation, and there's a huge pressure that this momentum is not going to be there or is already gone? Mary.
Well, first of all, I was glad that you quoted Jimmy Carter, because he was very much a founding member of the elders that I now chair, and a lovely, lovely man. He's an elder emeritus now, and he still keeps in touch, but obviously he's not active. But I do agree, he was there on clean energy and on environmental issues long before others. I was very active in COP26 as well, in the sense that I had a role as an analyst for Sky television. And it is true that business stood up and made significant commitments on forestry, on methane, on investing, etc. But governments did not. The G20 countries, I was calling them out because the elders name names, and I was saying the United States, even though John Kerry was being very active, is not stepping up. Australia is not stepping up. Thankfully, they have a new government. China didn't make any particular new commitments. Actually, India did make commitments at the COP, and so on. Saudi Arabia. So it's good to be an elder and be able to, speak truth to power. But I had a moment of emotion, to be honest, on air. I didn't like doing it, but I got quite emotional when I read the Carbon Climate Tracker report, which said that if all the pledges, both government and business, that were put forward both before, but particularly on the road to and at Glasgow, if they were all fulfilled, we would still be on a track for a 2.4 degree world. And I remember just literally being very emotional about that, because that is catastrophic. And that was the best we could do. So, and then, as you rightly say, we have the Ukraine war, which has become, it's a terrible, terrible war, a terrible invasion by Russia of Ukraine, in breach of the Charter and so on. But it's also devastating for countries so badly hit already by the climate crisis, by the COVID crisis, where we don't have equitable access to vaccines. And then they are the ones being hit very sharply, particularly African countries. I've spent quite a bit of time recently, both in Rwanda and in South Africa. And the food, fuel, and fertilizer costs have all gone up dramatically. And these are people affected by COVID. I mean, President Ramaphosa told us 2 million South Africans lost their jobs during COVID. So they lost their jobs, and then they're hit by high, and that drives them into an even worse poverty. So, and he called this the bystander problem to Ukraine, to that war, which he called a kind of European war, which in effect it is. It's a war on the continent of Europe. But the bystander impact is very strong. And then we have the preparations for COP27. And quite honestly, I am going to be, and the elders are going to be very outspoken over the next coming months, because nobody is stepping up enough. Nobody. And even, industry that was more committed has slipped a little bit. The United Kingdom has the presidency. I'm a friend of Alex Sharma. I agree with you. He did a great job in Glasgow. But the United Kingdom is slipping too. Everybody's slipping at the moment.
Thank you. I've just come straight from the House of Lords, and there was a question on food just before I left. And what we've started discussing, it's only in the last couple of weeks, is the real, I see it as a train crash in slow motion of the food crisis that is staring us in the face, with the port of Odessa blocked. I don't know how many of you have read David Beasley, the head of the UN Food Programs. Yeah. Can I just see a show of hands? How many of you have read David Beasley, UN Head of Food Programs, report just a few weeks ago on the food crisis based on the port blockage in Ukraine? Just a couple of hands. Read it. I don't want to alarm you, but it's real. 300 to 400 million people face starvation if that port is not unblocked. And at the moment, the Russians are not allowing any ships in or out. It's mined as well, the Ukrainians, for protection. And they can't get it out by road and rail. Vadim Prostaiko, the Ukrainian ambassador, who we work very closely with at CBI since the war started, he told me just the other day at our annual dinner, he said, it'll take 5 years to get the grain out if we can't get it out by sea, and this year's harvest will rot because the silos are full. What are we going to do as a world? What is the solution to that? Ponder that, because I'd ask each one of you if you have a solution to that problem. Great. Alyssa, if I may ask you the same question.
Right, okay, I hope I don't have to solve this grain problem. Okay, I'm going to take the question from a different angle. You asked if I'm optimistic in face of all of these other challenges. Well, I've worked on the issue of climate change for over 20 years. And last year when it was COP26, and I spoke to people who didn't know what my job was, and I work on climate change policy, they said, oh, your job is so trendy. I thought, well, that was never my main determining factor in what I chose to do with my life. It happened to be fashionable for a fleeting 3-month period last year, and I don't expect it to be fashionable again, particularly anytime soon. So it's lucky that's not why I chose my job. But I mention that to say that this is the nature of the climate change challenge. The nature of the climate change challenge is it is pretty much only 3 months out of 20 years the most fashionable, trendy thing. But it's one of the most important things for the entirety of that 20 years. And so we can point to any number of enormous problems around the world and crises that have happened over the past 20 years. We've got the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. We had COVID just going into COP26. None of those things makes it less important nor less possible to take action on climate change. So when we're having this conversation about net zero, I implore people to not use the term optimistic or pessimistic. Just use the term determined. Determined and focused that we're going to take action on climate change, but alive and conscious to the context. And the context is always changing. So what you're describing now is a very difficult, challenging context. But going back to something that you just said, which is really important, oftentimes these other difficult things that are happening are impacting the same people and the same parts of nature, which makes it even more essential that we take action on climate, because that's an underlying long-term problem that exacerbates these other things. And that was made very clear in the most recent IPCC report, that it's this overlapping of challenges that causes the biggest problems to both people and nature. So it's absolutely urgent that we do more, and it's urgent that we continue to meet in these international contexts to help countries lean on each other to remain committed to the challenge of climate change in these changing, troubling contexts.
That's fantastic. The context will always change, and there will always be issues. But look at India. India has stopped exporting wheat. India is now a wheat exporter, but not just because of the Ukraine situation, but also they've had a horrible drought because of climate. Yep. climate has caused a drought, which has affected this year's crop. So there's always going to be some problem. Just on a positive note, at CBI, we work with Deloitte, and we have the Goal 13 platform, and we surveyed businesses just before COP26 in October last year. And this is great news. This is the positive stuff, to your point. I hope I get these facts right. 79% of businesses believe that climate is a mega trend. So this is not fashionable, they believe in it. And 89% of businesses have at least one climate-related target. Isn't that brilliant? That's without legislation, that's without regulation, that's without being forced to. Businesses are doing it themselves. Great, thank you. Sarah, over to you.
I love the term determined, actually. So what I will share with you is some observations since COP26, and actually, you know, I hope we are determined and see some things at COP27. Just put simply, I think COP26, you know, we didn't really have a baseline or stability in the world, and I think since then, you're absolutely right. The context has changed. We've got commodity traders that can't even get a stable, you know, supply position on energy supply. We've got, you know, COVID and thankfully the return to some semblance of normality. And if anybody travelled over the bank holiday weekend, you know, we've fueled a complete surge in travel and a spike in, you know, aviation fuel demand. So you got these balances, and then you're absolutely right about the food poverty. And you know, we are in an increasingly unstable world. We don't need to, you know, labour the point. But actually, in the midst of all of that, we've seen some really powerful kind of citizen change agents. And I think going into COP27, I would love to see the amplification of the presence we had from business at COP26. I think that was really stark. Business are at the table, having the collaborative conversations that we need to have with governments, with NGOs, with the broader ecosystem. It's going to be really important that business are at the table in COP27. And then I think, you know, with business at the table, we can absolutely bring that determination and talk less about intent and more about the actions and the plans that we've got in place. There's absolutely no excuse that organisations don't have those plans in place. And in fact, it would be really heartening to hear of things that have failed and some lessons learned that we can actually learn from and accelerate our own journeys. And then the last thing I have a personal pledge in this as well, right? So I think it's really important that we maximise and amplify the voice of youth activists, different business models, different approaches to things. They were present at COP26, not as much as I'd like to see. I'd love to see more of Elizabeth Watuti, you know, or more of her on stage. I'd like to see Vanessa Nakate. We need to know about the situation in Uganda. I'd love to see more of Jack Harries and the climate activists there. These are the people that will give us hope and are thinking about these challenges in different ways. And I don't think we should pay lip service or just have them as tokens. I think they should be central to the conversation. So, you know, my personal pledge is to embrace more of those, but I think that's what I'd love to see at COP27.
Thank you. Well, what's really good news is, again, survey after survey show that young people, two things matter to them more than other things. One is they really care about climate change, yes, biodiversity, sustainability, the environment. It really matters to them. And the second is diversity and inclusion. They really care about diversity and inclusion. And I'm the first ethnic minority president of CBI, and we've launched Change the Race Ratio. Look it up, Change the Race Ratio, join up to it. Lots of leading companies, including yourselves, have all joined up to it. So
may I add one point, actually? Yeah. When you say it matters to young people, I was really shocked to see a report, the Lancet research report, that talked about the fact that nearly 80% of young people feel a sense of extreme anxiety. And I don't think it's something that my generation, or perhaps the generation before me, has grasped fully. We don't think it's real. It is real. There are mental health consequences that I don't think we've quite got our arms around yet or understood fully, but it's here and it's an issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So if I may just go a little further, the joint declaration by the United States and China, which everyone was really happy about at COP26. How do you think that's going to go forward, looking to Sharm el-Sheikh? Do we need more of that? Is that going to be, what progress can we see on that?
I think it was important because the broader US-China relations were not so good that John Kerry and his friend the Chinese envoy. They know each other very, very well. I know them too. There's a circle of quite close envoy friends, and they were able to forge it's a weak enough agreement, to be honest, but it's an agreement which is important. I think it's in more difficulty now because of the war in Ukraine and China's kind of neutral stance, but pro-Russian neutral, and also China has huge problems now itself with COVID, with the approach it's taken to zero COVID, if you like, and the supply chain problems. But China has not stood up on climate and has gone back, sadly, more to coal. China, when it makes commitments, usually implements. It was a pity that it didn't make a significant commitment at Glasgow, and it hasn't come forward since. Remember, one of the most important things to me of Glasgow was the commitment that because of the urgency, we couldn't wait 3 or 5 years. We needed a commitment in Sharm el-Sheikh by governments in particular of increased ambition, particularly the heavy emitters. We're not seeing preparations for that sufficiently. Egypt, Yasmin Faoud, the Minister for Environment, has said the whole conference, COP27, should be implementation, implementation, implementation. And she's quite right. But unfortunately, we're not kind of seeing I don't want to be, too gloomy, because actually I want to take up the point made about young people, but it's more than young people. I'm seeing more and more in the women's movement. I've noticed that we're the second panel where the majority was women. I'm pleased to see this. Women are taking over, and so they should. But there isn't much trust in our world. There's so much fake news. There's so much, it's a very divided world. Countries are divided. It's a difficult time. But there is a trust in different places. And I find on the difficult issues that we're facing now of the climate crisis combined with now the food and energy crisis, there's an enormous interest in the women's movement. And obviously, the young climate activists together have a great trust with each other and a great sense of being, in a very good sense, citizens of the world. And they care about those more affected, and they say it. I think there's also the intergenerational conversation, which the elders are very much involved in. I was glad to hear you talk about it from that perspective, because I think that intergenerational conversation is extremely important.
Fantastic. In fact, the trust is so important. And the best definition of trust that I've ever heard was in the pandemic. One of my Harvard Business School professors' favorite professor, called Frances Fry, you may have heard of her. I just summarize a whole lecture in 1 minute. She describes trust as a triangle, and a triangle where to get trust, whether you're a country or an individual, are you authentic? One. Second point, logic. Do you have the ability to deliver what you're promising that you say you're going to do? Do you have the professional capability to do it? And the third point of the triangle is empathy. And I think you need all three, authenticity, logic, empathy, to actually engender trust. Do countries have that? That's the big question.
Are we going back to China?
Yep.
US?
Yep.
Okay, so I think China and the US, this relationship is
and India, you can bring in India as well.
Okay, well the larger emitters, they've played a particular role in the COP process. So I think we all went through, a journey of everybody in the whole country understanding what COP was last year. And there's a bit of a cycle of these international climate change negotiations. And it tends to be a 5-yearly cycle. So notwithstanding what Mary explained, which is that the UK presidency reiterated that the next year should be equally important. The last time we saw this big China-US joint statement was in Paris. And so they provide, one of the things that this joint or big emitter conversation provides is some momentum for all the rest of the countries, like a beacon, a strategic beacon. So they repeated that at Glasgow. I would say that I don't expect them to repeat that at Sharm el-Sheikh. I just think that the use of that strong strategic power of a joint statement isn't something you can do every year. I'm not an experienced politician, so I'm not sure if that's what they'll do, but I think there are several other really powerful things that they can do jointly. One, of course, is reiterating stronger statements about their own targets in parallel. That would be very powerful. Another one is making strong commitments on climate finance. That's a really big priority for this COP. because Glasgow did not deliver on government's level commitments on climate finance. It really didn't. And that's something very important in Sharm el-Sheikh. And to have two very big countries say something about climate finance that might not be the same thing, but might be moving in the same direction, would be very powerful, because you'd expect the US to be a donor, and China, leading the group of negotiators that it leads, can be quite problematic depending on what it says about climate finance, either saying it's insufficient. But imagine what would happen if China started to say it might donate something. I mean, that would be sort of very different approach. So saying something on climate finance is the thing I think they could do quite powerfully, however that looks. And then the third thing is about action. So there has been a lot of talk, because of this close relationship between the two main envoys on climate, that they're starting to have joint meetings behind the scenes about how they take their cooperative strategic statement towards doing some things together, to some bilateral collaboration. And if we start to see evidence and discussion about what they're doing in parallel, together, and at home on action, that also shows people that these big emitters are really serious. Learning lessons. Maybe we'll hear kind of some of what you said, things that people have tried and haven't worked that they could do better. And countries aren't always very brave about saying those things, but that could be really powerful. So I'd say strategic statements are important, but might not happen this year. If we could have something on climate finance, collaboration on joint action, that'd be great.
Great. So
just one quick thing to add on that, so the joint agreement, great. To your point, picking up on action, I think COP27, Sharm el-Sheikh will provide a great forum and opportunity for both China and the US to demonstrate what actions they've taken so far. As far as I'm aware, November last year, Biden introduced law around the Infrastructure Investments Job Act, which is a great step in the right direction, fueling investment in renewables. But I think there's still a way to go. I think just one law passing isn't enough.
Okay, thank you.
And also, at COP26, there was an important commitment to double climate finance for adaptation, which has never been enough. The main bulk of it goes to mitigation, and adaptation now, just coping with the constant worse impacts, which have always been worse in developing countries, but are now impacting also the northern hemisphere. But the commitment to double climate finance for adaptation finance by 2025 is really important, and we need a roadmap, a clear roadmap by COP27, because developing countries are going to be looking for that. Yep. And they're going to be looking for commitment on loss and damage, absolute commitment on loss and damage. Oxfam just brought out a good report on loss and damage. Remember at the end when Alex Sharma actually was emotional in his own way, because we couldn't get the Glasgow facility for loss and damage. Yeah. This is going to be a big issue. It's an African COP, and the loss and damage, now compounded by the food, fuel, and fertilizer shocks, is really serious.
So, Mary, you read my mind, because my final question to all of you before I open it up to the audience is this whole concept of transition. So there's a great zeal, a sort of, we want to, it's climate change and net zero and 2050 and dates and commitments, but realistically there's also a transition. So we're going to need fossil fuels in the meantime. What about this phasing out and being practical about it and realistic about it, and allowing these countries, Badr Jaffar's earlier remarks about countries that have had very low emissions for many years but are now trying to catch up and reduce poverty, how do we work with this transition? So I'm going to start with you, Zara, and then we'll come down to you, Mary, and then we will open up.
I'll keep that question quite local, if I may, because I think there are bigger brains than mine that are qualified to talk about the transition globally. But if I think about the UK in particular, I remember asking Alok what he's going to do with Aberdeen and what are we going to see in the North Sea. So if I think about the energy crisis and, of course, our need to create and drive climate action and sustainability, my hope is that we don't go backwards. And when we think about opening up gas terminals, we are more thoughtful about the vulnerability that we experience in having to import, rather than actually using this as an opportunity to leapfrog and keep UK, with the fact that we've got the presidency, we should be absolutely front and centre in demonstrating how we can leapfrog and drive a greater energy transition here in the UK. And I think, Mary, you've got some very interesting perspectives around, time-bound utilisation of traditional hydrocarbons in countries that perhaps need it to have their version of levelling up. But I want to see the UK leapfrog.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the transition is going to be, I was discussing with someone earlier, a bit messy. It's not going to be straightforward. When we need to kind of think about each region or location, well, we used this word context before, in terms of its own situation and its own people, both now, but also what we're delivering for the future. So there are places where we know that you're going to need fossil fuels in the short term, and there are also places where people's jobs are very dependent on them in the medium and short term. So we should identify those as the ones that might need to be using the fossil fuels, but that means everybody else shouldn't be. So it can't be continue business as usual in some places and then make exceptions for some. It's got to be everybody else as fast as possible, even faster, to compensate for that. The other sort of, I guess, part of the story. Oh, I've lost my train of thought temporarily. So I think when we think about the future of the UK, and we've got ambitious net zero targets for the UK, we've got a very well-constructed adaptation framework program here as well. That's because when we think about the future of the UK as a whole, there are some difficult transition regions in the UK as well. We imagine the future of the UK to be fossil fuel free, to be net zero, to be this, my vision of the future is one, maybe it's a bit utopian, but it's very clean feeling. The air is clean. There are great jobs for people, and they're of a certain nature. I think it's fundamentally wrong to think that there should be a different future vision for other countries of the world. And notwithstanding people's ability to survive the next 10 or 15 or 20 years where they might need fossil fuels, let's not reconstruct the 80s for those people. Let's help them construct the 2050s that we want to see here in those countries as well. I think ultimately the best way to do that, of course, is to enable, empower, and those people wherever they are to take the leadership and control of their own destiny. And that's where we go back to climate finance. Because the way to do that is there'll be some barriers. Quite a lot of those barriers will be financial. If they're technical, there are some facilities for sharing knowledge as well. But let's empower other people to have that vision that we ourselves see for ourselves in 2050.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're into very seriously the era of just, and I would say, equitable transition. And just transition, I'm afraid, for the countries that have used fossil fuel to industrialize and to build up their economies has to happen much faster. The war in Ukraine showed a dependency on oil and gas from Russia. That shouldn't be an excuse to try and look for oil and gas elsewhere. Lots of agreements about gas elsewhere. No, it should be a real determination to move as rapidly as possible in a moonshot way into clean energy. And I mean moonshot way. That's what it should be. I'm very conscious of a just and equitable transition for African countries because I'm on the Mo Ibrahim Prize Committee and Foundation. I'm on the Africa-Europe Foundation. I'm the honorary president for Europe. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is the honorary president for Africa. We have our Women Leaders Network where we discuss these things. And I have listened. You have 600 people who never switch the switch for electricity in Africa. You have 900 million plus who cook on dirty cooking, charcoal, wood, animal dung, etc., and inhale and have a lot of deaths and illness from that. I think we need a just, time-bound gas transition for some African countries. Some African countries don't want it. Kenya doesn't want it. I think Ethiopia won't want it, but Nigeria and some other countries do. What I don't want is the infrastructure, that would become stranded assets so quickly, because we will be savage on stranded assets elsewhere when the time comes. And I don't want Africa. But I think we need a thoughtful. We should have done far more to help African countries to go clean. I mean, remember in Paris, the commitment of developing countries in their nationally determined contributions, they all wanted to get into clean energy. Yeah. But they needed the investment, they needed the training, they needed the skills, they needed the IP, and they got nothing. Yeah. So, just transition has to be just and equitable.
You're spot on. I mean, here's some scary statistics. Under the current and planned policies, an estimated 660 million people would still lack access to energy and electricity by 2030. And then the top 20 access deficit countries, to your point, Mary, account for 81% of global population without access to clean fuels and technology. So spot on. Questions, please. Raise your hand, and if you want to direct it to, and your name, please, and your organization, and if you want to ask a specific panel member, let me know. Who wants to go first? Yes, over there.
Hello, I'm Ellis Hall. I work for a company called Future Net Zero. You talk a lot about Africa, and in some of the reports it states that there'll be huge migration issues in the future. You know, sub-Saharan Africa, nearly 700 million people might be looking to migrate out of there within the next 10 to 15 years due to the fact that they won't be able to survive in these countries. Do you think the leaders at COP27 and future COPs need to be considering this, the future landscape for where are all these people going to go if these countries aren't habitable?
Thank you. Mary, would you like to?
Well, I think it's, it depends on the just and equitable transition. If countries are helped now, I think we should mention one good thing that came out of COP26, which was the commitment of 8.5 billion to South Africa,
yes,
to help South Africa to come out of 80% dependency on coal. I was in South Africa recently. I had very high-level meetings, including with President Ramaphosa himself. There needs to be more, awareness that part of that has to be grant money, and that it needs to be very clearly defined, and that it must be a support for South Africa, which has a very good nationally determined contribution. Its policy and its commitment is strong, and there's a sort of feeling that, the donors, having made a promise that they're not fulfilling, are now having, almost trying to drive things, and it's, that's not the way you do it.
Yeah.
And so they're all kind of, but we will see much more migration from Africa if we don't have more of a just transition, more finance for resilience building, more loss and damage. That's, and in particular, clean energy that provides the jobs for African countries. I mean, it was good to be in Rwanda recently for the Sustainable Energy for All conference. There's 4G throughout the country, and that allows all kinds of projects on mobile phones. Yes. And you see, an entrepreneurial activity. But for huge areas of Africa, that's not the case.
Absolutely. And the South African public-owned Eskom has been in a really bad state anyway, so they need help.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to the next question.
The load shedding.
Oh, tell me about it. So, do you want to come in very quickly? And I'll
maybe say something quickly on migration. The thing about migration is it's more of a second-order effect of the other impacts of climate change. Yeah. And also, migration of the scale that you see in those reports, it's really the final thing you would do as a person is move, actually. The evidence really shows that because of people's sense of place, their culture, their history, migration, the kind of thing a security person might shudder at, like a mass migration, is really the last resort of those individual people. Before you get that kind of movement, you'll get things like temporary migration of the main earner in a household might go and come back, all these kinds of movements. So what we really need to be focusing on is actually this piece about responding and adapting, making ourselves resilient to those climate changes so that it doesn't lead to this final effect. I think if people focus too much on migration, it might motivate some people, but it might lead to the wrong kinds of actions, which are end-of-pipe actions about migration, rather than the front end of what are the things we need to do to make ourselves able to cope with it. Yeah. And it might be managing the movement of people, it might be, but it doesn't need to be a kind of unstemmed flow of people in an emergency type situation.
Thank you. That's very, very valid. Second question there. Thank you.
Alessandro Soretti, Fleischmann Hillard. It was mentioned on the panel that preparations for COP27 have been quite slow so far and been below expectations. And I wanted to ask the panel why this has been the case so far and also where we should be in that process of preparation.
I mean, I've been speaking to some of the different people involved in the preparations in Egypt, and I think they're working hard. They're quite well supported by people in the UK, actually. So the UK COP presidency is offering some support to people in Egypt. I think what's quite good and exciting about the Egypt COP is that it will have this Africa focus, and the Egyptian team is very focused on making sure they represent it as a regional gathering, not just regions as representing Egypt as an African country, but also they're pulling together Arab nations. So they're allies in different formulations, which I think will be really powerful. So I actually think there's a lot of good things that are quite different than what happened at COP26 that will deliver something complementary. Yeah, it's always a short time to go from one COP to another.
Yeah. I was on a panel recently with the Minister for Environment, Jasmine Faoud, and she said she wants it to be the most inclusive COP. She wants young people to be there. She actually, on the panel, a young person was speaking, and the message came through that she would have to leave soon. And the young person was interrupted, and she immediately said, no, I want to hear this young, because I want young people. But actually, Sharm el-Sheikh ain't cheap. That's the trouble. So there's talk now about a ship might sail and help accommodation for young people and young climate activists, etc., which would help. Because at the Sustainable Energy for All in Rwanda, it was very helpful. I was mentioning this earlier. Yeah. There were so many young people there that on the panels I was never on a panel with only one young person. It was always at least two. And it made a difference. That diversity, the voice, the ideas, the energy, the initiatives, and yet Egypt is very badly hit by the blockage of food. It's very, very dependent on both Ukraine and Russia for wheat and bread.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And you mentioned young people, Zara. Do you want to just come in on this quickly before I go to the next question?
About young
people.
I'm not going to comment on whether COP27 is slow or not. And I would, as I say, I want to see representation from businesses and young people. I think there are so many ecopreneurs and different ways to do business. This is a bit off tangent here, but you said comment on young people. And actually, I wanted to pick up on a point. When we talk about energy transition, it's really rare that we have a more holistic conversation about polymers and the extended value chain that hydrocarbons feed. And so thinking about young people, I came across, at Davos, a gentleman called Luke from a company called NFW, Natural Fibre Welding. And he was wearing trainers, a belt, and carried a wallet made from a material called mirum. And it is entirely nature-based. There's absolutely no plastic at any stage involved in the production of this material. And he is not looking at how do I get this into fashion houses. He is saying, how do I disrupt the multi-trillion-dollar supply chains and value chains of plastics end to end? And so when you think about energy transition, coming at it from that angle, a young person, dynamic, thinking about business models in completely a different way, that's the importance of having them represented.
Yeah.
And you think about sorry, I'm on one now. Do you want me to stop?
We're out of time. So.
Okay, I'll stop.
No, but you're spot on. I've just had a meeting with a friend of mine who runs a plastics business that converts plastic into usable products, which is fantastic. And the more of that happens. Yep. We're out of time. At a very quick point, if you want to make a question there, and the panel, respond briefly in any last remarks, and we'll close the session. So. Far away.
My name's Ivor Tucker. A quick question about following on from the young people. COP26 had quite a lot of engagement from kids in the UK and schools. How can we replicate that with Egypt, which is obviously going to be a lot further, much more difficult? But how can we keep the interest of school kids in the UK engaged in something that is, for them, significantly more remote than Glasgow?
Can I please look up Jack Harry's, right? And honestly, the key to this is whilst we might not be able to engage everybody and take everybody to Sharm el-Sheikh, because, you had the logistic challenges there, the power of social media and the linkage and access, just look up this gentleman called Jack Harry's, and I promise you that will help you answer that question. I really feel passionately about the fact that how he's harnessed social media, how he's harnessed the power of storytelling, how he's paired up with Silverback Productions, who did all the David Attenborough recordings. It just will blow your mind, and utilising the power of technology and remote access will keep more than young school children engaged.
Fantastic, thank you.
We've been doing a little bit of collaborative work between UK universities and Egyptian universities, and the Egyptian universities have plans at the moment, nascent plans, to set up a kind of ambassador program from their students at the universities through to other people in society, which would include school children as well, which is nice to see that we might get the same push that we saw in the UK when we hosted COP that brought many, many more people on board might also be happening in Egypt.
Thank you.
Well, certainly one of the events that I remember with great pleasure at COP26 was with schoolgirls organised by WOW, Women of the World, as an event. They reached 3,000 girls from 14, 15, 16 on. And what I worry about is Sharm el-Sheikh being a resort, not a city. It may be harder to physically have enough young people and enough of that sense of reaching down. But actually, that generation is absolutely vital because they're the ones that are going to be affected for the rest of their lives, and we need far more education and awareness at that level. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, and there's an initiative called the Climate School that's being launched about teaching employees and companies about what all this matters. A company makes a commitment, but how does each individual employee relate to that and help it? So there's lots that we can do. What a fantastic panel. So Sarah from Salesforce, Alicia, Imperial College, and Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland. What a star panel. I think a huge round of applause. I just want to make a couple of remarks to try and summarize a session like that, particularly with such an august panel, has been fantastic. But the context, I think, is something we've got to take really, really important. Determined, you mentioned, Zara, being determined. Young people kept coming up. Transition, trust, which is we spoke about that. Climate finance, delivery, action, adaptation, the loss and damage. Transition kept coming up, not going backwards, really important. And I love the way that, Alyssa, you talked about this clean feeling. Wouldn't it be wonderful where we have green hydrogen heating our homes? We have trains powered by green electricity. We have wind power. We have an interconnector to Morocco with solar power coming across. And we have no fossil fuels at all. And we have clean air. And it's net zero is fulfilled. I think that dream is something I can visualize. And just an equitable transition is absolutely spot on, Mary, always. The migration aspect, the questions were fantastic. The Africa focus being the most inclusive COP. And ecopreneurs, I think that's a great term, and the disruption that's going to be caused, and of course, the schools, and wow. The session was wow. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Well done.
Thank you very much.
Karen, Mary, Zara, Alyssa, wow indeed, thank you very much, a really great session. So here we are, the final panel of today, and look, we've had a brilliant lineup of speakers throughout the day, and I'm really pleased we're going to end on such a high note with an in-discussion session with Ed Milliband. Ed, of course, is the MP for Doncaster North. Congratulations, by the way, on Ed, on your new city status. He's also Shadow Secretary of State for Climate Change and Net Zero, and when he was Secretary of State in government, introduced the Climate Change Act in 2008. So Ed, you were ahead of this before many of us, I'm sure, and I think of you as totally synonymous with this whole agenda. So it's going to be a great session, and you're going to be joined on stage by the CBI's Chief Campaigns Director, Saima Kalassi Aldridge. So Ed, Saima, come onto stage, join me for the final session of the day.
Stage. Thank you very much. So, Ed.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us.
We're the light entertainment, I think.
We are. We decided we were the evening
We're between
slot.
you and drinks.
So we've got a few jokes for you. We'll leave you to judge whether they're
Fine,
funny.
I have some jokes, yeah.
You're going to come up with them as we go. So, introducing Ed, as well as being the MP for Doncaster North and a self-professed climate nerd, you host your own podcast, of which I'm a big fan, and you are the centre of an online movement, the Milliband. But you've also had some even more relevant parts of your career for this. So previously as Labour leader and the Secretary of State at the Department for Energy and Climate Change, where you were instrumental in passing the Climate Change Act, in setting carbon reduction targets and establishing the Committee on Climate Change. I hope some of you caught Chris Stark earlier on today. So Ed, you are now the Shadow Secretary of State for Climate Change and Net Zero. Thank you for joining us. I get 15 minutes and then we're turning to audience questions. So get them ready. So I think it's worth starting off with some scene setting. We are in a global energy crisis. At home, we're experiencing a cost of living crunch, which is impacting the poorest the hardest, and politics. And all of this changes the context for the action on net zero. So in your view, how do we balance that energy security and costs alongside the need for a zero carbon power system?
Well, look, first of all, Simon, can I just say it's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank all of the people in the audience for your leadership, because I think the business community has led brilliantly on this agenda over the last decade or more. I also want to particularly single out the CBI and the job that Tony Danker and you are doing on this issue, because it is incredibly important to have not just business support, but business leadership on this issue. And I know from just scanning the participant list at this conference, how many leading businesses we have in this audience who are leading on this agenda. Look, I think in a way, Tony's remarks this morning answer your question very well, which is we face three crises, not just one. We face a climate crisis, but we also face a cost of living crisis and indeed an energy security challenge, at least a challenge. But I think what is different today than a decade ago when I was the Climate Change Secretary a decade or more ago is that it is absolutely clear that the answer to all three crises is what I call a green energy sprint. And a decade ago, people would have said, well, you can go green, but it's going to cost you more. A lot has changed in a decade. But one of the things that has changed most of all is that the economics have moved so decisively towards the green agenda. We don't need to simply make the ethical case. We do need to make the ethical case, but we can, I think, confidently make the economic case. And obviously that's true of onshore wind, offshore wind, solar. We've got very exciting developments in hydrogen, a whole range of areas where I think you see the economics moving in the right direction. Now, the view I take about this is we need to go full pelt for that green energy sprint. And so, to the extent, I like the fact that in this country, climate change is not part of the culture wars, at least not for the most part. But where I have an issue with government is where they don't go consistently on that agenda. So, evidence-based policy says onshore wind is one of the cheapest technologies at our disposal. I know you've got to have proper planning processes, but we cannot have a planning process that effectively bans onshore wind in England. It doesn't make sense. It drives up people's bills. As Tony said this morning, we should be going, the biggest no-brainer in policy making in Britain today is energy efficiency. We have the worst insulated homes in Europe. I was in the States 2 weeks ago, and I would say to the audiences I was speaking to, of course, if you've been to England, we have drafty homes, and they would laugh. There's so much we can do in this area. So I think the answer, and I think we should be absolutely clear about this, that the answer to all three crises is going green.
So can we just focus in on this energy efficiency point a little bit more? Helping people with their bills and the cost of energy bills is a short-term solution. It's a sticking plaster, right? And actually what we need is something more long-term that's going to bring bills down. So we first worked together when you were Shadow Bay Secretary and I was working in the aerospace industry. And you understand the role industry needs and wants to play in getting to net zero. And there's a huge amount of investment, public and private, that's needed in order to get us where we need to go and achieve that transformation across industry, the sprint that you call it. But achieving this is going to need government and industry working together. And using the example of energy efficiency, so it was your job at one point, and at one point it was mine when I was in DEC, to make this stuff work. And this morning we were calling for further action on eco and extending eco a little bit more. How do we make that happen? How do we get that partnership working properly? And who pays? And how do we get that support?
We've got to have a plan. You've got to have at least a 10-year plan on this. I mean, it's really interesting looking at what's happened over the last decade with the Green Deal, the Green Homes Grant, and so on. And I don't think we should deny that there are significant delivery and cost challenges with this. But it's got to be a partnership between public and private sector. And there's got to be a plan. Now, I think it's got to be, I did a scheme when I was the Energy Secretary, which was a house-by-house, street-by-street scheme. I think if that is what you're going to need, it's going to need to be locally led. I mean, we're working on the details of this, but it's also going to need public resources. You know, we are not going to get the transformation. I was talking to John Armitt this morning about this from the Infrastructure Commission. We're not going to get the transformation that we need without, the public sector can't do all of it, but, you know, it's going to have to do some of it. Now, we've said, and this was a commitment that Rachel Reeves made last September at the Labour Party conference, that we would put £28 billion a year, each and every year, into climate investment, and £6 billion of that would be for the household sector, for insulation and zero carbon energy. And we think that is the right decision. Now, why do I say that? Because although I said the economics is moving in our direction on climate and on the green transition, what is the one thing that could stop it happening is a backlash where people say it's not fair. It's not fair to me. And all of the polling and the evidence shows it, and it's not surprising. And so, you know, we've made a decision that it's right to collectivize some of these costs to make it possible to make this transition and do it in a way that is fair. So, look, you know, eco is important, and it's bad that there's a gap in eco and all of that, but that is a scheme that puts the money on other bill payers. So I think we, you know, plan, government investment, partnership with the private sector, and crucially, as John was saying to me this morning, and John knows a lot about these things, delivery. You know, if I become the Secretary of State for climate change and net zero, and this is something I'm already spending some time thinking about, without measuring the curtains. But you know, there's a massive delivery challenge. You know, and government is bad at delivery, and so I think that would be my sort of response.
Yeah, and I think what we think is that there's also action that both industry and government can take together, and things like Eco Plus that we were calling for this morning are. And
I think it's very welcome.
I'm watching that red clock. I want to look ahead internationally, right? So there's roles for domestic governments, there's roles for domestic industry, but there's also the international stage here and the commitments that are made on that. So I want to look ahead to COP27 and your expectations of that. You described progress at COP26 as modest and not the transformation that was needed. So what are you pushing for at COP27 and building on the momentum from the recent G7 climate leaders?
I mean, look, I don't want to be the sort of gloomster here, and you know, I have great respect for Alok, who I know spoke here this morning. I mean, I would say the sort of international picture is not brilliant. You know, countries made this commitment they would come back in a year's time to review their commitments. You know, since then we've had you know, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We've had a global spike in energy prices. I think the best I can say about this is a couple of things. One, we've got to learn the right lessons of the crisis, and we've got to do our bit here. Because I think there is a danger, let's be honest, that people say, well, the response to the fossil fuel crisis is more fossil fuels. And we have to, I think, say that is not the answer. And it's obviously different for different countries, but I think it's very, very important that is the case. Somebody at the UN said to me 2 weeks ago, you know, the part of Sharm el-Sheikh is to do no harm, and sort of not take us backwards. Secondly, and I'm sure Alok will have said this, in the end, the reason Paris worked and the reason that Glasgow made some gains was you have an alliance of developing countries and high ambition developed countries. And that means we've got to deliver on some of the things that we haven't delivered on. And I have great respect for Mary and the incredible work that she has done, but, you know, delivering on loss and damage, the famous 100 billion, which I was part of at Copenhagen, the $100 billion of commitment. And also, I think these partnerships, I think the partnership in relation to South Africa, I think they're interesting, these interesting partnerships with the private sector. So, look, I think we need to make progress, but I think the international situation is difficult. And I think it's incredibly important, and I know the administration understands this, that the US tries to deliver something. Because the US is going to be having the Major Economies Forum later on this month. And, you know, for this process to move forward, we need US delivery.
And do you think we'll get it?
I don't know. I think you sort of, you know, who knows? It sort of depends on a whole range of, British politics is complicated enough without me getting into US politics.
It was worth a try. So this is my last question before I turn to audience questions. So get your questions ready. You've had quite the career.
Yeah.
Even before you got this job,
Yeah.
you've had quite the career.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about...
You airbrushed out the 2015 general election, which was nice of you, actually.
I said quite the career.
Yeah,
You can
exactly.
interpret that however you like. It spanned a lot of different things.
Yeah, I've become a veteran, yeah.
There you go. You're a vet. And you're now back out on the doorstep, right?
Yeah.
And something's got you back out onto the doorstep. And climate is no longer a niche. It's no longer 10 years ago, only a few people were talking about it. It's mainstream. So what are the sorts of things that you're hearing? What do you think this is going to be a vote winner at the next election?
I mean, I'm doing this, I don't want to sound pious about this, but I'm doing this and I'm back in frontline politics. The most important reason I'm back in frontline politics is because I care about this issue. And I think, as David Attenborough has so powerfully said, the next few years will determine the next few thousand years. And, if that can't get you out of bed, then I don't know what can. So this really, really matters. On your point about the doorstep, and I think this came through in the earlier session very well, I think we collectively are in the better lives business, not just in the stopping disaster business. And I think if there's one big piece of learning I've had over the last 15 years being involved in this, is that we tend to be better at talking about the disaster avoidance business and not as good at talking about the better lives business. I mean, Lord Bilimoria was saying in his summing up, this is about clean air. This is about, clean power. This is about a decent public transport system. This is about good jobs at good wages for people across the country who feel that they have not been part of this economy. So it can be a vote winner for whichever party, articulates the vision, but it's got to combine, as I put it, the people who are concerned about the end of the world and the people who are concerned about the end of the week. And bring both together. And I think you do that by saying, this is about climate and this is about the long-term threat we face and indeed the short-term reality that we face, but it is also about an optimistic vision of the country.
Thanks very much. I could keep going, but that red clock is going down and I'm sure there are questions in the audience. There aren't.
They know that drinks are coming.
It's not one question. Oh, there we go. I would have been surprised if there wasn't.
Hi, my name's Ivor Tucker.
What's your name, sorry?
Ivor Tucker.
Hi.
Hi. This is an issue that really should be transcending politics. Unfortunately, in the UK, it does seem that all political parties, some minor exceptions, are at least committed to the net zero agenda and everything that it applies to that. How can we translate that into getting a cross-party engagement with the issues so that there aren't point scoring by the politicians about things, but it becomes much more of a consensus of that we've got to do this, and sort of trying to apply that same thing to the health service, which again is really in need of reform. But the health service shouldn't be a religion. It needs to be something that, and the same thing applies with climate. There are some issues that are too big for party politics. How do we address that?
I mean, I'm not going to try and reform the health service in this answer. I apologise. So I think you're sort of half right, if I can be completely honest about this. I think where you're absolutely right is that we should celebrate the fact that we have a politics where both major parties are committed on this agenda. And I do think that I think David Cameron actually deserves some credit for this, because I think he moved the Tory party on substantially in the sort of mid-2000s period. And the support that came for the Climate Change Act was cross-party support. And I think that's incredibly important. And I think it is important that the government, both the May government and the Johnson government, have carried that on. I mean, where I sort of I don't exactly disagree, but I think I'd make a sort of an additional point, is that having contestation in this area is not a bad thing. So when I was the climate change the energy secretary, climate change secretary, and Cameron was sort of breathing down our neck, saying, go further, I mean, that was good for the country, because it was pushing us to go further. And so I hope what I can do in the role that I'm in, and hopefully then in government, is push further. Because, you know, if I had a sort of advice to the government, it would be, you know, go further, go faster, and do so more consistently. And so we will push them on that. And then there's one other point here, which is, I think, about your kind of orientation of this. And I think this is a Rubicon that I wish the government would cross. And I know that probably people like Alok think this too, which is if we say to the steel industry, you're going to have to make the transition on your own to net zero, it's not going to happen and we won't have a steel industry. If we say to individuals, you're going to have to make the transition more or less on your own to change your boiler and get a heat pump, and it's 10,000 quid, we're going to have a backlash. If we say to people, well, you can have an electric car, but only if you're rich, we're going to have a backlash. So the big T word comes in here, which is the Treasury. You know, so if I had one wish of the current government, it would be that the Treasury embraced this more and understood that it can be an advantage for Britain and for the business opportunities there are if it sees this as an investment, not simply a cost.
I think that was, you know, that point you made about pushing each other. I think that was what was quite successful about the coalition years, was that they were pushing each other to do better.
Sure.
Oh yeah, they're all coming in now. We've got one at the front here.
Hello.
Company.
Sorry, say that again, I'm sorry.
Olga Muscat,
Hi.
Bain and Company. We've heard through the day today about the need to mobilize business, but also how business works with policymakers, and especially in a breakout session that we had earlier today, about the struggles that when you go to delivery and you meet local government and you meet lots of various agencies, great plans, grant to a halt, 13 years for a wind farm, 3 years for carbon capture and storage, and examples multiply. What is the Labour vision for a reform on how the government structure for the whole country is organised and how different agencies work with respect to net zero?
That's a big question.
Well, Olga, I think it's a really important question. And look, I'm not going to give you a very good answer. The question's better than the answer, but we're not tooled up for this. I just don't think I don't think government is tooled up for this, and this is what I'm thinking about. And this opportunity of a new department, if Labour wins the election, is a chance to think about this. And one of the things I was talking to John Armett about today was absolutely this delivery question. And I don't think we're tooled up for it centrally, and I don't think we're tooled up for it in local government, which I think has got an incredibly important role, and I'm sure we're not tooled up for it in agencies as well. I mean, it's why when, you know, governments of both parties say, let's cut the back office, I always sort of think, well, hang on a minute, the back office are the people who are going to be delivering a lot of this. So I think you're right. That's one thing. Secondly, I hope you'll sort of think that we've done this when we get to the election. There needs to be a sense of a plan. And there just needs to be a sense of a plan. It's not just about energy efficiency right across the board. I published in 2009, I think, the Low Carbon Transition Plan, which was an attempt to give some certainty to business. Because uncertainty, as Simon said to me earlier, is the enemy of investment. You see, I didn't just steal it naturally from you. I credited you. But you know, so I think that's the second thing. A plan, and then thirdly is consistency of policy. If you send the wrong signal and suddenly say, well, you know, maybe fracking is the answer, I think it sends a very strange signal to, when I talk to onshore wind developers, they say, well, it's just not worth bothering in England. You know, Scotland, maybe Wales, but, you know, it's just not worth bothering. So, you know, plan, consistency, and then tooling up for delivery.
Thank you. There we go.
Chris Dodwell from Impacts Asset Management. It's great to see you again. We worked together in the 2000s,
yes.
And it's brilliant to see your passion back engaging with the topic.
Definitely.
The thing I wanted to ask you about is this vision that you're talking about, the consistency and the kind of dependability. My poster child for that at the moment is the European Commission and the European Union with its Repower EU proposal. They recognise that getting off Russian gas means you're going to have to make some sort of investment in the transition, but they are laser guided on the idea that actually accelerating the clean transition is the way forward, and they need to address energy efficiency. One of the things they're not doing very well is engaging investors and trying to have a dialogue, and I remember that you were passionate about that when you were running DEC, and we got the kind of low carbon finance group. Is that the kind of vision you're talking about, what the European Commission's putting out there? How do you sort of see that in comparison to others?
Yeah, and look, I think it's, Chris, thank you for the question, and I think it's I'm really glad you asked it, because just let me sort of preface my answer by saying we are incredibly keen to engage with business on this. We have big decisions to make about delivery, about how we allocate our climate investment pledge. I am very conscious that there are lots of businesses who won't be in this room, but will want to be part of this transition. Small businesses, for example, I'm sure we have small businesses represented here, but who won't necessarily be in the green, think of themselves in the green space. But, you know, we talk a lot about homes. We talk sometimes about public buildings, but what about all the businesses who could really benefit from energy efficiency, who think, you know, who don't necessarily think about this, but could, with the right incentives and the right structures, really benefit. So the engagement is incredibly important. You know, secondly, the public investment that we make will be dwarfed by the private investment that is required, and I'm completely conscious of that. And so, you know, one of the things that we are thinking about in relation to this public investment is how does it lever in private capital? And so it's absolutely crucial. I think, by the way, that the City of London, you know, Mark Carney has done brilliant work on this, but I think there's even more that can be done in this area. And then the last thing I'll say, you talk about the Commission and the work that they are doing, and they're very interesting. It's been a very interesting response. That's what we set out plans for a green energy sprint, as I call it, around renewables, nuclear, hydrogen, right across the board earlier on this year. But where we want to get to by the election is so that people in this audience and investors think, okay, well, if there's a Labour government, I know what they're about. I may not agree with all of it, but I know in this space what their plan is, not just for five years hence, but at least for 10, 15 years hence. This is the pathway. Because I think, you know, in this area, and the carbon budgets and the CCC is incredibly important, but the pathway really matters. And this is, sorry, it's a long answer, but the last point I'll make is this, which I think is really important. Because I'm a nerd, and Simon said I'm a nerd, which I definitely am, I'm a climate nerd, I strongly recommend that you, I'm sure you've all read this, but the Fiscal Risks Report produced by the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is excellent bedtime reading, you know, they say, look, if you delay climate action by a decade, it doubles the cost because you lock in high carbon choices. You know, the zero carbon home standard, which didn't come in 2016 as it was planned to, I'm not making a party political point here, but just happens to be the case, it means we've built 1 million homes to a higher carbon standard that we'll have to retrofit at much higher cost. You know, high carbon choices cost money and are more expensive because we've got to get to net zero. And so, you know, what I hope is to give the private sector that pathway, that sense of where we are going, and this is a work in progress, so that, as I say, if there is a Labour government, people have a sense, okay, well, this is the vision, and I can bank on that vision.
I think this is the right audience for you to pitch that OBR report. It's appreciated. We've got time for one more. We've got David in the front here. Just say it really loudly, David, and I can repeat it.
Thank you. I'm David Cairns. I'm from Equinor, a Norwegian energy company and one of the proud sponsors of today's event. Thank you for a fascinating session. I wanted to ask a question about skills. So one of the criticisms from the audience earlier today was that business doesn't do enough for skills in schools. And I think the reality for many of the companies in the room is we think we're doing stuff in the communities, but it probably doesn't add up to the sum of its parts. At the same time, in the country, there's a great shortage of skills. At the same time in the country, you've got the perennial problem of unskilled or lacking skills in the community. So is there a way together we can do this better? Thank you.
I mean, it's really important, and I think it is, regrettably, it's always the afterthought or tends to be the afterthought, and it's probably one of the biggest barriers we face to the low carbon transition happening. Because if, it's all very well me talking about energy efficiency and retrofit, but where is the skilled workforce going to come from to do this change? You're obviously speaking about your experience and the question of skills. So, I wish I had a sort of easy answer to this, but let me just say to you, yes to the partnership. Yes, it's definitely on our radar, thinking through, because it's a delivery question. If we want this to be the decisive decade and to move as fast as we can, how are we going to tool up the people to actually do this in the time that we need? And I don't think we have a good answer to that at the moment. And then the last point I'll make is, and I think it's sort of implicit in your question, I think there is a real chance to inspire people about this. I think there's a real chance to, if I think about, young people in the schools in my constituency in Doncaster, an ex-mining constituency, which is proud of its mining heritage, I think there's a real chance to say to those young people, look, just as Doncaster powered the country, in the last century, so it can help power the country in this century, and you can be part of that. And I honestly think that's an incredibly exciting offer to young people, but, and I don't have an answer to this, but count on the fact that we are thinking about this with my colleagues, but we need the infrastructure to make that happen. And I'd really welcome a further conversation about it.
Thanks, Ed. I think that's a really good note to end on. Going back to your better lives, not just fighting disasters, thinking about better lives in communities and levelling up across regions and nations as well. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks to all of you for coming
really
as well.
Really appreciated it.
So
can I say one thing?
You can say one more thing.
Look, the only other thing I just want to say is that, I think this is an incredibly exciting mission for the country, as I hope is clear. And I know politicians tend to say this, and then maybe your experience is a bit mixed, but genuinely my door is open, and I really welcome engagement with you can find me in different ways, but I really, we won't get this right if we don't do it in partnership with the business community. I genuinely believe that. I know that's the case. So, I hope we can have those conversations in the coming months, so that if Labour is in government, we can get this right.
Thank you, Ed. And we've got more conversations tomorrow. So we've got Helen Whately, HMT Minister. We're going to hear from our President, Curran. We've got Minette Batters from the NFU and many, many more. So please do come back tomorrow. If you are coming back tomorrow, don't forget to bring your lanyards, because we want to reuse them and recycle them and not get new ones. Please join us for the drinks reception, which is, I'm sorry that we have made you late for, but it was such a good conversation, I didn't want to stop it. Sponsored by Bain, where Rain is going to be launching our decarbonisation community, and we look forward to welcoming you. Thank you all for such a great day.
Great. Yeah. We should go on tour.